Hi, everyone. Okay. Nice to see you today. My name is Jade Barger. I'm one of the curators of the 15th Gwangju Biennale. And this year, under the artistic directorship of Nicolas Bourriot, the curatorial team was invited to think through and probe into how artists today are responding through various sonic practices to the way space, whether physical, digital, social, or symbolic, is organized, controlled, contested, and always transforming. And central to the emerging visual and sonic imagining of the spaces we live in is the notion of planetarity. And today we have Jussi Parikka joining us from the cloud layer to guide us through his take on the emergence of environmental aesthetics that characterize the knowledge of the planetary as thick surfaces and volumetric envelopes. So Jussi is a cultural historian, a writer and a theorist working as professor of digital aesthetics and culture at Aarhus University. His most recent book, co-authored with artist and researcher Abelardo Gil Fournier, was published this year, titled Living Surfaces, Images, Plants, and Environments of Media. And today's presentation will be informed by this recent research. Parikka has also worked as a curator, including on the curatorial teams of the Helsinki Biennale in 2023 and Transmediale 2023, where I was lucky enough to be working alongside him and witness his intellectual generosity. So Jussi will be speaking for 30 minutes, and then we will be in conversation for 10 minutes. So during this time, if you want to prepare your questions, because we will open it to the floor as well, for the remaining 5 minutes. So now I would like to, leave the screen to Jussi.
Thank you so much, Jade. Yeah, it was really wonderful to work with you. And thank you, Jade, and everybody else, curators, technical team, everybody else who's sort of enabled me to talk from the sunny morning of Aarhus, sunny morning in Denmark, whereas it's afternoon, hopefully a sunny one there as well. I'm going to jump right in because I know that we're a bit late with the schedules, but also we have limited time. I really want to be able to engage in a conversation as well. So let's see, I might need to skip a couple of sections. I'll talk about surfaces, as mentioned. Let me see where we are. Yeah, sorry. The talk itself draws on the book that I will talk about a bit more in a second, Living Surfaces. And it draws on the work we've been doing in Aarhus. I've been engaged in 2 projects over the past years. One of them was on operational images and transformation of visual culture. And the other one is design and aesthetics for environmental data, which takes place in Aarhus, as in the project takes place, where we are thinking about the ways in which different spatial notions of the environment and emphasis on space and architecture build a slightly different sense of abstraction. Most of what we know about the planet, climate change, and so forth is through abstractions, but those abstractions happen always in concrete places. I tried to write this little talk as a response to curatorial themes that emerge that you've been discussing and that you will be discussing and that are visible in the artistic works, especially the points about space, about new topologies, about new world maps that respond to not only the traditional genres of how we make maps, what sort of cartographies of the present we are engaged in. I am very much interested in the sort of critical post-humanities take on critical cartographies that try to make sense of the various new territories that are emerging or that must emerge, and some of the ones that should disappear as well. Now, I'm very aware that my talk is not so much on the soundscape aspects, more on the territorial or territory and space aspects But some of the things I will say resonate perhaps with the theme of invisuality and invisual, which I addressed in another recent book, Operational Images, where I was trying to pitch how to think about other registers beyond visuality of signal processing, abstractions, and perhaps even sensing. And so we might want to return to that later. But let me get started. So I want to talk about a specific kind of a complexity that relates to media and media art, environment, and ecological knowledge, as well as one of the big topics of past years of discussion in the humanities and design and art as well, that is planetarity. This complexity is in my talk condensed into a particular notion, spatial notion, namely that of surface or surfaces, although that space turns out to be fundamentally about mediation. These kinds of surfaces imply interfaces, as well as the force of flattening as a core cultural techniques in this long history. This is what the philosopher Sibylle Kremer has argued in her work, that the various kinds of, that the world is obviously multidimensional, but we are surrounded by seeming flatness of two-dimensional surfaces of different kinds, map making, projection techniques, other media techniques, how they flatten the world into images, or what we call images, or what used to be images, through mathematical, as well as other procedures as well. So there's something interesting about abstraction producing flattening, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not flat in the sort of a like negative sense only. It's just de facto so. I am going to talk about it, and I'm not going to talk about this. I'm less interested in flatness as such than in surfaces that are slightly different. They are dynamic, they're growing, they are ecological, and they are living, those kinds of surfaces. Often, dynamic surfaces are flattened, of course, into inscriptions, graphs, patterns, data visualizations. And some surfaces can always be read as information full and in ways that resonate with the past years of intensive interest in critical forensic practices and different ways of understanding traces across surfaces or inscriptions as their core methodology. As for living surfaces, these surfaces become thick. They become thick as soil, thick as bushes, thick as forest canopies, agricultural lands. They can reach out to environmental sensing techniques that operate on the orbit and in software and become manifested in the visual aesthetics of the planetary. So, for a moment at least, forget what you heard about the world of environmental concerns being round as the famous Cold War period images, the blue marble and others, taken from space aboard NASA spaceships. Instead, we are dealing with, and these were, of course, as well, synthetic surfaces, composites built upon other synthetic landscapes, and where images and landscapes merge. And it's more of a patchwork than a smooth, nice surface, round planet, and it is back of this sort of a planetarity. All of this sounds like a speculative narrative, but it resonates strongly with many of the artistic works on show at this biennial, as well as other works, just two examples on screen, that we've been witnessing in contemporary art across years. Of course, there would be a long art history of surfaces in different ways and vegetal surfaces as well. And of course, it is implied also in the curatorial narrative about atmospheres and environmental change. So much of this talk will be about living surfaces, the new book with Abelarda Hill-Fournier that just came out in June, but I will return to that soon. Two, surfaces indeed. In a recent study, University of Copenhagen, also in Denmark, University of Copenhagen researchers mapped with satellite imagery and AI or computer vision applications the extent to which the world is made of greenhouses, the archetypical space of controlled atmospheres. At least 1.3 million hectares across of the planet's surface is covered by this particular building type of a glass house or its close equivalent, the thin plastic film that protects against weather or insects and pests. In this particular study, much of the scientific focus was on how to use multispectral remote sensing data from satellites to revise the existing estimate of how much of coverage of the surface is occupied by this architecture for plants. But it's also an interesting kind of a resurfacing of the planet in name of food logistics, in name of food security, the particular areas where the growth is particularly intensive, especially in global south. And these are really interesting geopolitical statistics, of course, as well, such as distribution by country, as you can see here, as well as for instance, the unwanted effects from the plastic surfacing or covering of plants and plant surfaces that then creates another kind of a problem, namely plastic pollution across landscapes, across metabolic chains, organic life, beyond that one particular location. So in this sense, the satellite-enabled view to planetary coverage of this architecture for plants speaks to a historical periodization, as well as the emergence of glass houses. This happens in 19th century, but they become, of course, explosively increased in 1970s and 1980s in the so-called global north, and more recently across various regions in Asia, Africa, and South America. One could refer to this as satellite sensing greenhouse architecture complex that itself presents a new kind of a typology for landscapes, a sort of a terraforming. Another example, briefly, also satellite images. A satellite-enabled view to resurfacing, in this case deforestation, of a large area of trees to make a way for another kind of an architecture, the Tesla Gigafactory near Berlin in Germany. One could speak of this near 400-hectare clearing in terms of what I coined about 10 years ago as anthropocene, the obscene impact of environmental destruction that ties together lands and technology, corporate hardware industries, and the various effects of not just climate change and climate damage, but also biodiversity crises. It implies the other side of computational landscapes as landscapes that are part of the material production and hardware as well. This is, of course, about computer technologies or computational technologies of autonomous driving, and it is not. It is about resurfacing. It is about deforestation as a resurfacing, a large-scale planetary aesthetics that itself implies various levels of abstraction. Somebody would argue that this concerns an estimated trade-off, that all these lost trees are measured in terms of CO2 impact would be be also then counteracted with the reduction of gasoline cars from traffic, which is obviously not a very solid argument. And the other side relates to development of new deforestation detection tools that would be automated in relation to deforestation regulations, and as such link these observational views of the radical changes to planetary surfaces with policy. Now, these two examples, these are an entry point. To take a look at the planetary surface and large-scale surfaces as a particular aesthetic, a particular digital aesthetic even, of remote sensing and satellite data images, and how they cut across the various notions of numbers and abstractions and statistical governance, of how we make sense of the planet as abstractions, and how we make sense of the planet through remote sensing, and try to understand this two-mode movement, what the surface is, the surface transformations, as well as the models as abstractions. 3. Now, living surfaces is our take with Abelardo on these issues, whereas we look at various kinds of historical case studies that deal with this longer trajectory or history of statistics and data, computation of landscapes, but also this particular kind of aesthetic that emerges by way of different scales of surfaces. It concerns the material formation of vegetal surfaces, but also architectures for those surfaces, of built environments for natural things like plants. The book is a mix of sort of artistic methods, but artistic methods that we actually mobilize not for art in this case, but for history of science and technology, of looking at sort of experimental practices, but also through this experimental take of how we can map a 200-year history of planetary management and how this looks from 21st century perspective in the midst of these massive scales of reforestation, deforestation, and various other processes that are significant, not only for the surface itself, but they impact across a whole stack of verticality from the atmosphere to the ground to the soil. The book grows out of our interest into plants and media technologies. It grows, of course, also out of our work with art practices, especially Abelardo's, but also our interest in looking at plants through the ways in which media technologies, visual even, not just visual, of course, have been central to formulating what we know about plants, plant growth, their physiology, but also large-scale development of different kinds of managed, controlled plant surfaces. From early, somewhat photographic practices that measured light values in relation to plants and plant physiology, to the very famous cases of using cinema, time-lapse imagery, and so forth, or to understand plant movement, to new image worlds of growth and light. We wanted to ask of what would be the logical steps in this trajectory of media plus plants as such. Abelardo's own artistic practice, as well as his scholarly practice, relates to this, as well as some other colleagues as well that haven't been part of the project, but whose work really strongly resonates. So I had Tipu to Hararoha and Femke Snelting, for instance, for their wonderful project, sort of an inventory of volumetric plant regimes in this sense. That is a nice reading accompanying our living surfaces because of the ways in which it also looks at different technological practices, remote sensing, modeling, and so forth of so-called plants. In our book with Abelardo, we trace different scales of these environmental media as plant surfaces. And these become then gradually, in the historical sense, integrated into biosphere and the sort of envelopes, another surface concept, the envelope, right? That become an entry point to how we think about the planet as a living, complex geo-biochemical entity. If we had more time, I would tell you a story about Russian soil sciences, colonialism, and the emergence of biosphere thinking, but we do not have the time. Just let it be, perhaps it's enough to mention that this is, of course, the trajectory that becomes the infrastructure in a way for a lot of later Gaia thinking, right? From 70s to Bruno Latour and so forth. Not to say that that's Russian colonialism, that's not the point at all, but there's an interesting history to Gaia, biosphere across 150 years as well. Our story with Abelardo is, of course, partial. Practices of controlled environments in early plant logistics, from the greenhouse to the boarding case for transporting live plants, to plant physiology and measurement of light, and on the much expanded scale, the biosphere, but also later techniques in agriculture, well, earlier techniques in agriculture, but also later techniques in agriculture, such as precision farming, that really start to work on questions of soil, but also plot, and the various ways in which management of growth is datafied, so to speak. So we take the surface as our focus of our attention, and we take it as our method as well. I'm going to skip a bit of certain things because I know that we're, very restricted on time as well. So I don't want to sort of take too much to make sure that we got time for questions. I could always keep on listing these various fantastic and weird case studies from history of science about surfaces and management of the planet through whether it's a singular plant or whether it's through large-scale surfaces. But I also want to flag that it constitutes a method of how to see the world through surfaces. What would the world look like if we look at it as a patchwork of surfaces? Now, a lot of the work also in the biennial, and this is sort of informed by my chats with the curators as well. So those of you who are able to enjoy the works, please, of course, do. And try to see the resonances across different artistic pieces in the exhibition part as well. In a way, I found strong resonance with how Sung Tiu speaks of their work in terms of spatial storytelling and architectural installations. We are, in a way, also, one could pitch this as a version of spatial storytelling of planetary surfaces and how they become a sort of a narrative about the globe that is not round, but is actually constantly produced by media technologies. Of course, this long history of control would also imply a long history of extractivism and extraction that itself presents a very different way of looking at surfaces than the usual art historical story in modernist aesthetics. Hence, look at the work of Unmake Lab. Again, you were talking as well, Unmake Lab people were talking in this conference as well, about extraction and transformation of landscapes. So this is very short. I won't go into this. This is the more academic bit as well. There's, of course, wonderful precedents into this kind of work. So hat tips to Juliana Bruno and the ways in which her work has already mapped the notion of the surface as part of media and art aesthetics, as well as architectural aesthetics, juxtaposing ideas about texture, architecture, cinematic moving images and projection into a really interesting methodology, as well as Esther Leslie, whose a very different methodology still looks at surfaces, namely an art history of artificiality through synthetic chemistry and the chemical industry. That is a history of basically modern chemical industry indeed, but also fertilizers, artificial colors and coloring, film and other plastic materials. And this becomes especially particularly important part of our thinking as well, because it's both about the aesthetics of recovering and resurfacing the world since late 19th century, chemistry, plastics, and so forth, as well as a particular kind of really a material surface, of course, in those terms as well. And we are interested in this sort of like a concreteness of the chemical, for instance, as well as how it escalates into all kinds of levels. One could continue talking about various ways in which these controlled environments of surfaces include property regimes, they include ownership, they include also, of course, questions of artistic practice. Again, we could map several interesting links that hopefully will be nicely resonating, at least on an implicit level, both in the talks as well as in the actual art exhibition. Jakob Knudsen's immersive synthetic landscapes is a great way of understanding that idea about landscapes and images conflated, emerging, and the other one informing the other one. In another register, Wang Yuyan's wonderful film, Green, Grey, Black, Brown, is really a compelling version of the synthetic surfaces at the back of the plastic petroleum complex that has really dominated the production of planetary scale surfaces and synthetic imaging, again, through 150, 200 years at least. As well as, of course, Agnieszka Kuran's work in so many ways. And much of this really concerns the idea of patchworks as such. Now, I was thinking of talking about planetarity and planetarity beyond the planet, right? The idea that planetary might be of a different scale than the planet itself as a geological, geographical entity. This section that I'm going to skip would have talked about the idea of what would be a planetarity that is defined by circulation of abstractions. Again, a couple of great works that resonate, not the only ones that resonate, but for instance, Haseeb Ahmed's and Brian Leatherberry's work on abstraction, whether it's financial abstractions, for instance, is really a great way of thinking about what I think also is about planetary logistics of abstraction. And that's just left there as a hint. Now, I've got only about 7 minutes left according to my schedule, so I'm going to really move on. I'm going to do a really short section on a film that we're working on and then conclude, and then we'll have a discussion. So besides all the theoretical thing and historical themes, I and Abelardo have been working through images. We've been working through images as part of our methodology to think images with images. This was part of our video essay, Seed Image Ground from 2020. And we've been continuing that with another collaborative project. And now I truly hope that we don't have sound on. Yes, let me just move this off. I'm going to put it on the back because it's not ready yet. And this is not an official screening. This is just a snippet of a new work we're working on. And let me explain why I'm showing it to you while I'm talking. We are now finalizing our second collaborative film project that also speaks about surfaces. It is called Lumi, which is snow in Finnish. It continues our visual investigation of planetary mediation in the context of climate damage and how models of media are not just applied into existing environmental conditions, but also should emerge from our understanding of what is the current ecological situation. In short, we ask, what is planetary light as a different kind of understanding of light media, visuality beyond the visual register, as it enters questions of temperature, atmospheres, and radiation at the back of disappearing glaciers, at the back of disappearing coldness, at the back of this transformation of heat distribution across the planet. I would like to think of this work as in an implicit dialogue with the great work by Sadia Mirza and the sort of interest Sadia has in, and both in the work but also earlier in terms of sensing, and of course in this Gwangju case with Antarctic ice. With Lumi, it's a 17-minute video essay. We're not going to see more than 3 minutes now. Where we again use image composition and video techniques to build a narrative about surfaces. This is less about growing ecological surfaces than it's about the forms of visible and invisible radiation that the planet receives and the planet reflects back. A key part of the narrative itself is the albedo effect, which is basically the measure or the ratio of light reflection based on different surface types, such as snow and other white surfaces and their high reflection, such as darkness and dark surfaces and how they absorb light and hence increase certain kind of a condensation of temperature as such as well. It becomes a narrative about the cryosphere, but it also has a particular science fictional angle. Let me read our short introduction text before I go and summarize the whole talk. I'm going to leave this on so you can see the images that come from historical data sets of photographic practices in 19th century. So even if it's quote unquote science fiction or climate fiction, it's drawing on imagery across 150 years. So Lumi is a story of snow and luminance, of reflection and planetary light. The video essay arranges historical photographic data sets through the perspective of an imaginary synthetic intelligence trained for a repainting of landscapes as part of an operation of restoration. Also, the landscapes are revealed as synthetic. They once made and then they are remade. At the center of the operation is the albedo effect, a measure of reflection of light as it hits the surface of Earth's surface. Processing through images of the past becomes an exercise in mapping and restoring light as patterns and reflections to compute and to model a disappeared landscape of snow and light, of snow and coldness that consisted of light and temperature. So Lumi can be seen as science fiction of an intelligence that moves between a past of images and a future of programmed landscapes. The intelligence has itself grown out of those moments of light computing its path, together with the landscape computing its growth and preservation. The video is narrated from the perspective of artificial agents who time travel from old images to future computer models. The video is a dataset of snow, ice, and light. It is also about reversal of time that was captured in snow, ice, and light. I'm going to leave the video here as a short teaser trailer. It will be ready in early autumn, so very soon, I hope, after which hopefully you'll be able to catch it somewhere. I'm going to do very brief conclusions. I'm aware of the time. So basically, I'm also pitching questions here, even if I know that you might have questions as well. So we'll be going back and forth with questions. One of the ways of summarizing this brief, condensed talks was to ask how it responds to that brief about new typologies and topologies for planetarity. Firstly, looking at surfaces as images and images as constructing surfaces expands not only to the media and technological production of the planet, but it's also about artistic method. What are the scales that are currently implied in art methods? What new territories are being produced and imagined in artistic practices? How do they make sense of the genealogies of the planetary, while also pitching alternative histories of genealogies of the planet? Secondly, what images pertain to this planetarity without becoming cliches? What sorts of maps stay true to the complexity of the situation and help us to maneuver its ethical and aesthetic stakes as well? And then importantly, also for today's theme, not just today's obviously, is there more than visual at play? Something that could be coined invisual. I like to think about it as the different spectrums of radiation and signals that are not just visual. We can think about it as wavelength signalscapes, even soundscapes. These things that are also part of our practices and many of the practices and talks, but also in this conference. With that, I'm going to end my talk and we can engage in a bit of Q&A with you. So thank you for your attention and let's talk. Thank you.
Hi again.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Jussi, for this talk. I will have a couple of questions, and then, yes, if the audience can prepare theirs as well. So first, I wanted to pick up on the last point of your presentation, on your last opening question of yours on invisuality that you hinted at, and ask you to expand on the significance of what you call the more than visual or the invisual. And I'm doing this because I can sense an echo as well with the last talk that we had with Seung-Chu. But also generally across the Biennale, so many artists are engaging with the ways the world expresses itself in signal and noise, and many of which lay beyond our perception, and how technology helps us sense some of these signals, pregnant with information, through imaging technologies. So ecographic technology allowing us to visualize within and beyond flesh, and seismology to sense through the Earth's subsurface. But many of these signals also do not make it to the visual. And so I also wanted to ask you to speak about this, especially in relation to Seung-Chu's work as well, and its relationship to invisuality. Seung's work can also be read as a history of surfacing and resurfacing through chemical practices, as to use your terms, to borrow your terminology. So the proprietary chemicals used in fracking fluids that Sung shared and focuses on her installation are hidden from view and knowledge, rendered invisual by trade secrets and legal frameworks. So my question is, how does technology, and including law, if understood as a technology of social organization, engineer visuality or invisuality, and how does this invisual realm that you started speaking about so what remains unseen or deliberately obscured, highlight the limitation of our current visual culture in addressing environmental challenges?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's exactly the thing. The works there probably do it in really interesting ways, and I wish I could be also in longer dialogue, both in the conference and with the artists, because it would be nice to tease out this from their perspective. I'm interested in exactly that question. Even if I'm writing about images, I'm interested in how they've been haunted by abstractions. They've been haunted by signal realities that often are seen as dualisms. Okay, we have images, but that's the surface. Then we have the deep reality of signals and all kinds of datafied abstractions. The duality necessarily doesn't need to be there at all, but we're interested in what kind of manifestations can we tease out from images that are information rich and that at least can act as proxies of the other forms of sensing as such. Now, there's two things. I think that two things that are slightly different that I'm talking about. One is about individuality and abstractions, right? The ways in which not everything can be condensed into an image, and especially a representational image. This was the core sort of call by Frederick Jameson and others when they were calling for that sort of a cognitive mapping of capitalism, that itself would be too large to be captured in an image, right? And that's sort of the political task of what would be, and this is of course answered by many smarter people before me in so many ways. What is the sort of mode of imaging something that is beyond an image, right? So that sort of image problem. And then there's the sort of a problem of sensing, and how do we pitch sensing? And that's why artistic practices are an interesting position, because of capacity to work through methods that pick up on different sorts of sensorial realities that are still signal-based realities. Now, there would be a longer story as well about, which I'm not completely certain is so true, but the idea of images and space, and then signal-based realities, including sound and their relation to temporality. I'm interested in that question of how to rate temporal on an aesthetic level, but also as a form of knowledge, something that comes out in sound works, right? But it comes also out in moving images. So I would sort of revert back to that question as well of what is the particular way in which we can use temporal-based signal aesthetics, whether it's sound, whether it's other forms like moving images, to unfold something that is both a narrativization of these weird abstract realities that go beyond the image that is almost impossible, but still are able to pitch it in particular ways that interfaces with our capacity to sense. So that's a very abstract sounding answer, but it sort of relates to that, tapping onto that basically methods that try to understand signals. Even if it sounds super techy, it doesn't need to be, as we know. There's multiple kinds of sensitive ways of tapping into that, and sound would be one.
Thank you. I was hoping we could also speak about this notion on synthetic surfaces and synthetic landscapes a bit more. So many artists in the Biennale are developing vocabularies and languages and aesthetics and affect to articulate what it means to live in exhausted landscapes and to be implicated agents in processes of exhaustion. And one of the films that you mentioned, Yu Yan Wang's found footage film, Green, Gray, Black, Brown, that I suggest to everyone to watch on the third gallery of the Biennale Hall is a collection and patchwork of human and machine interaction with environmental surfaces, both natural and synthetic, plastic and plants at the same time. And one image that stuck with me within this film is one where we see a pile of factory rubble being painted green to trick potential surveillance from the air into thinking it's a patch of green grass. And so it's a sort of surface trick to mislead authorities into thinking environmental regulations are being met. And so as the story goes, the trick did not work, but it speaks about the practices of playing with surfaces, but also the practices of adaptation to the way we are being read by machines. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this, this kind of interaction in between speculated operation of surveillance from above, machine vision, synthetic landscape, and this play of dimensionality as a decoy, using this kind of flattening language of digital and satellite technologies that you spoke about very early in your talk through mapping, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And this comes through, it's also in the operational images book, which is, by the way, being translated into Korean. So hopefully next year or so. I mean, my training years ago was, a lot of it included Paul Virilio. So also this wonderful scene that you just described, and the film is just wonderful, right? Is, I guess, firstly, a version of what Virilio also calls as logistics of perception, that military, but also for at least Virilio, by implication, then their latest non-military applications of technologies are basically about sensing, but also tricking sensing. In other words, all kinds of obfuscations across a whole logistical field of where you are between hide and seek, right? So it would be sort of one could read it as part of this military history that has become the history of all kinds of other forms, not just military forms of management and mismanagement as well. It resonates also beyond that. It resonates with a lot of other sort of spoofing practices, some of them dubious as well, including in that I really didn't go into, but the sort of abstractions that come about with carbon offsetting and the creation of phantom forests for those purposes. So there's a constant sort of a spoofing that is going on in this seemingly rational automated logistics as well, which I find super interesting in such terms as well. And I think it nails really beautifully the idea that the resurfacing of a thing for a particular spoofing of a machine or computer vision is itself making the surface into an image that itself might be just a different color. But that sort of a back and forth brings home the point that it's already we've been engaged with creation of synthetic landscapes as images. Now they're particularly part of this automated logistics of seeing and misseeing, but it's sort of it goes way beyond also the automated circuits of seeing and misseeing as such as well. And I think, yeah, as you say, it's a beautiful way of understanding exactly those two things that I think are completely still under-researched, as well as, in terms of work, there's plenty of room for more of that work. Chemistry or synthetic chemistry, as well as so-called algorithmic, automated, remote sensing, AI even, practices of seeing as well. And those two things are beautifully connected in the film as well.
Thank you. I was told with a sign that there's no more time. So maybe we can open it to the audience. If anyone has questions, there's someone here. I don't know what's your POV you see, but if you can see the audience or not.
I don't. Okay. As you can see.
Hi. So I have a question that relates to the narration that you've shared with us. That starts by talking about the flatness of the visual mappings that we're exposed to, and particularly in what relates to agriculture or agriculture visualizations. All the samples that you've shown relate to basically flat or rather flattish type of agricultural methods. that presuppose that the land itself is flat. And as I'm sure you very well know, this is not how agriculture has been dealt in all societies. There are different traditions, both found in the Andes and in South Asia, that actually reshape the mountains in sort of stair-like structures. In South America, in the Andes, these are called andenes. And actually this reflects a completely different tradition of architecture and technology management of agriculture. And I was wondering if you indeed have taken this into account, given that this, the type of visualization that it would be required to incorporate these type of structures into the digital realm wouldn't be two-dimensional, but it would require three-dimensionality. And as you can see, all the technologies that are currently used as well for monitoring agriculture in the global south are based on two-dimensionality, because these type of structures are not taken into account. So I was wondering if you have thought about this tradition as a way to, let's say, question this linear portrayal of technology that ultimately emphasizes on the two-dimensional and this type of visualizations.
Thank you. Jade, are you able to kind of like summarize the key points, because the sound is super bad. I appreciate. I got some of part of the points, really interesting, but I didn't really catch the whole question as such.
Okay, so correct me if you want to come. Do you prefer coming, or because I think the microphone is closer to me? So okay, so basically, if I understand correctly, the question was in relationship to agriculture and how you understand surfaces as highly three-dimensional or not. Looking at practices in South Asia, for example, of sculpting the land and mountains. So I imagine like for rice as well. Like I just had this in mind, like as something that is much more high dimensional than like the agricultural lands that you might have shown on screen. I think that was.
In order to take this into account, and when one takes this into account, it serves as a way to question this linear narration and how we've come out with this type of technology that bases on two-dimensional imaginary.
Yeah, two-dimensional what, sorry?
Visualization.
Visualization.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point, because exactly like I started, my point is that living surfaces are not flat. That's exactly the point. Mm-hmm. And that comes about both in the appreciation of the ways in which verticality works by way of soil, as we know, the complexity of soil, as this the massive complexity of soil as a sort of a ecologically such a beautifully weird realm on its own already, let alone the ways in which the idea of plant surfaces already implies atmosphere, because of the role of not just photosynthesis, but also the production of the atmosphere. So there's a whole vertical stack already implied, but then also like you really nicely put it out there as well, that it's not that agricultural lands are flat either in terms of what you just described. There's a whole dynamics that is not necessarily always captured by way of flatness at all. And that makes the whole point really interesting. And on the one hand, we have beautifully interesting histories of irrigation systems across Southeast Asia, for instance, that have a particular dynamics that some have described as early computational logic of landscapes, not the sort of a computation in the narrow sense, but this really like embedded into the landscape itself. So there's something about irrigation already as well in those terms, as well as then the sort of implications for what, and this is not an endorsement, but like what people in advanced sensing, technological sensing are trying to capture by way of the complexity of different scales of soil, whether they're successful or not, and whether it comes out as flattened 2D images, that's a different story. But yeah, absolutely, exactly. And that's the point, is that these are surfaces that are somewhat images, but they're not flat, and that makes it super interesting. Basically, philosophically, it's like an image that grows, image that itself is complex, grows, multi-scalar, wonky, it goes across hills, instead of being flat. So besides the ways in which what that story tells about surfaces in the sort of ecological sense, let's also think about the other ways round. What would be these sort of rice fields or other forms of living surfaces, dynamic soils and so forth? What kind of a notion of an image would they produce, right? And that's really interesting as well, right? What would be an image then that would come about from that? What would be the artistic methods of working with images or sounds that come from that form of dynamics, right? Great. No, it's a great point.
If there's any other questions for Jussi. Otherwise, do we still have a bit of time, or should we wrap up? No? Okay. I think we ran out of time. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to thank you very much, Jussi, for your presentation and for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Enjoy. See you all soon. Bye-bye.